On the 8th of November, 1879, a 79-year-old woman died in a charity home for destitute women in Washington, D.C. She had no money. She had no visitors of consequence. She had not been invited to a dinner party in years. But 40 years earlier, the President of the United States had convened his entire cabinet for the sole purpose of defending this woman's honor. His vice president resigned over her. His Secretary of the Treasury fled the city to avoid being shot over her. And the man who replaced them all, the man who became the 8th president, owed his rise to a single calculated act of kindness toward her. Her name was Margaret Eaton. Washington called her Peggy, and she never held a title, a fortune, or a single day of official power in her life. A tavern keeper's daughter married a senator, refused to be shamed, and accidentally detonated a chain reaction that dissolved a presidential cabinet, destroyed a vice president, and made another man president of the United States. This is her story. Chapter 1. The Tavern Where Presidents Were Made. The most politically dangerous building in Washington in 1810 was not the Capitol. It was a boarding house on I Street run by an Irishman with a charming daughter. The city itself was barely a city at all. In 1810, Washington held fewer than 9,000 free residents. Pennsylvania Avenue was a dirt track. Cattle grazed on the mall. The Capitol building was half finished, its dome still decades away. Foreign diplomats called postings to Washington a punishment. One British minister compared the Capitol to a swamp with pretensions. But government had to happen somewhere. And in a town with no hotels worth the name, no reliable restaurants, and no social infrastructure beyond a handful of churches, the boarding house was the center of everything. Congressmen lived in them. Senators ate in them. Deals were struck over breakfast. Alliances formed over whiskey after dinner. The boarding house was not adjacent to power. It was the room where power lived. William O'Neill understood this. He was an Irish immigrant who had come to Washington and built the Franklin House into the most important of these establishments. His location on I Street put him within walking distance of the Capitol and the President's house. His food was good. His whiskey was better. His wife, Rhoda, came from a family with connections to the governor of New Jersey, and his daughter, Margaret, born around 1799, grew up in the dining room where the country was being run. Picture what this meant for a girl. By the age of 8, Margaret O'Neill could recognize every senator by face. She knew which ones drank too much. She knew which ones were kind to servants and which ones were not. She heard arguments about tariffs, about the Louisiana Purchase, about whether to go to war with Britain again. The Franklin House hosted members of Congress from both parties, military officers awaiting orders, lawyers seeking federal appointments, and journalists looking for stories. Margaret moved through all of it. She poured coffee, she played piano in the parlor, she sang for the guests after dinner. This was an education no finishing school in America could match. But it came with a paradox that would define her life. Margaret was raised among the most powerful men in the country, but she was the innkeeper's daughter. She could talk to senators, but she could never be one of their wives. She inhabited the world of political power without belonging to it. She was fluent in its language, but barred from its society. Her father saw to it that she had every advantage he could provide. He sent her to one of the best schools available to girls in the capital. She learned French, she learned music, she could hold a conversation about politics with men twice her age and leave them impressed. A contemporary described her as having the most beautiful and most ambitious nature. Another called her the most attractive woman in Washington. She had dark hair, vivid eyes, and a wit that men found either captivating or threatening, depending on how secure they were. But beauty and intelligence in early 19th century America were assets with an expiration date. For a girl of Margaret's station, there were exactly 3 paths: marry well, marry poorly, or don't marry at all. The Franklin House gave her proximity to the first option. Her father's profession guaranteed that respectable families would resist it. Washington in these years ran on a social code as rigid as any law on the books. A woman's reputation was her currency. A man's wife determined his social access, and social access determined political influence. The dinner table was not a metaphor for power. It was the mechanism of power. Who was invited, who was seated next to whom, who was acknowledged and who was cut. These were political acts with political consequences. The women who controlled these tables, the wives of senators and cabinet secretaries and foreign ministers, held a form of authority that no statute granted and no election conferred. They were the gatekeepers. Margaret O'Neill grew up watching these gatekeepers operate from the wrong side of the serving table. She learned every rule of the system. She just never accepted that the rules applied to her. And that refusal, that single stubborn insistence on existing in spaces where she was not supposed to belong, would one day bring the most powerful government in the Western Hemisphere to a standstill. But first, she had to fall in love. Badly. More than once. Chapter 2. 2 Elopements and a Funeral. By the age of 15, Margaret O'Neill had already attempted to climb out of her bedroom window with a soldier, and her father had already caught her. The soldier was Major Belton, a much older military officer who had been boarding at the Franklin House. The details are murky, as they tend to be when families work hard to suppress them. What is clear is that Margaret, barely into her teens, tried to elope. William O'Neill intercepted the attempt. Some accounts say he found her already at the window. Others say he caught them on the street. Either way, the message was plain. Margaret O'Neill was not going to follow the script. Her father's response was practical. He sent her to New York, away from the boarding house and its parade of available men. It did not work. In New York, Margaret reportedly became entangled with another officer, a Captain Root. The details of this affair are even hazier, filtered through decades of gossip and political slander. What matters is the pattern. Margaret was drawn to men in uniform, men who moved through the world with authority, men who were not intimidated by a woman who spoke her mind. The pattern also revealed something about Margaret that her enemies would later use against her. She did not perform modesty. In an era when a woman's virtue was measured by her invisibility, Margaret was conspicuously, unapologetically visible. She talked, she laughed, she looked men in the eye. In the parlor of the Franklin House, this made her charming. In the drawing rooms of Washington's elite, it would make her a target. By 1816, Margaret's father had settled on a solution. She would marry. The groom was John Bowie Timberlake, a Navy purser from a respectable Virginia family. Pursers handled the money aboard naval vessels, purchasing supplies, managing accounts, paying sailors. It was a position that suggested financial competence. Timberlake seemed to offer everything William O'Neill wanted for his daughter: a good name, a steady income, a path into respectable society. The marriage was a disaster almost from the start. Timberlake was an alcoholic. His finances were not merely modest, but catastrophic. A purser's position in the early Navy was a breeding ground for debt. The government supplied inadequate funds. Pursers were expected to cover shortfalls from their own pockets and seek reimbursement later. Reimbursement that often never came. Timberlake owed money everywhere. His drinking made the problem worse. He was frequently absent, deployed on long naval cruises that left Margaret alone in Washington for months at a stretch. She did what any practical woman in her position would do. She went home. She moved back into the Franklin House with her children and resumed her role at the center of her father's establishment. She poured the coffee. She played the piano. She managed the house when her parents could not. And she remained, as she had always been, the most interesting woman in the room. This was the arrangement when a particular senator from Tennessee checked into the Franklin House and changed everything. Margaret Timberlake was now in her mid-20s, married to a man who was rarely present and never solvent, living in her father's boarding house, raising children, and operating in the precise space where political and social Washington overlapped. She was not looking for a scandal, but the scandal had already been arranged by circumstance, and it was checking in downstairs. Chapter 3. The Senator Who Paid Her Husband's Debts. In 1818, a 28-year-old widower checked into the Franklin House, and Margaret Eaton's life split into before and after. His name was John Henry Eaton. He was a senator from Tennessee, one of the youngest men ever to hold that office. He was also the closest political ally and personal friend of the most consequential figure in American politics, Andrew Jackson. Eaton had written Jackson's campaign biography. He had managed Jackson's political interests in Washington, while the general remained in Tennessee. The two men were bound by loyalty, by ambition, and by a shared identity as frontier outsiders in a capital that regarded them with suspicion. Eaton moved into the Franklin House and became a fixture. He ate dinner with the family, he spent evenings in the parlor. He developed what even the most charitable observer would call an unusually close relationship with the landlord's married daughter. The precise nature of that relationship became the most debated question in American politics for the next decade. Margaret's enemies would later claim that she and Eaton were lovers while Timberlake was at sea. Her defenders insisted their friendship was proper, chaperoned by her parents, conducted in full view of the boarding house. The truth is probably somewhere between the two, but the truth never mattered as much as the perception. What is documented is this: John Eaton began paying John Timberlake's debts. He used his influence as a senator to secure Timberlake better naval postings. He wrote letters on Timberlake's behalf. He became, in effect, the financial patron of a family whose husband and father could not support them. In the social mathematics of early Washington, this was either extraordinary generosity or a down payment on something else. Andrew Jackson himself was tangled in the arrangement. Jackson stayed at the Franklin House when he was in Washington. He knew Margaret, he knew Eaton. He appears to have actively encouraged the relationship, or at least to have seen nothing wrong with it. Jackson's own marriage to Rachel Donaldson had been shadowed by accusations of bigamy and scandal for decades. He had a particular sensitivity to the way polite society could be used as a weapon against unconventional relationships. This sensitivity would later become an obsession. In 1828, two things happened in rapid succession. John Timberlake died aboard the USS Constitution in the Mediterranean. The official cause was pulmonary disease. The rumor, whispered immediately and never fully silenced, was that he had cut his own throat after learning of his wife's affair. There is no credible evidence for this. The ship's records indicate illness, but the rumor was a gift to Margaret's enemies, and they would use it for years. Timberlake's death left Margaret a widow, with children and debts. It also removed the only obstacle between her and John Eaton. Jackson, now president-elect after his crushing victory over John Quincy Adams in the fall of 1828, urged Eaton to marry Margaret quickly. Jackson understood that if Eaton was going to serve in his cabinet, a long courtship with a woman already surrounded by gossip would be worse than a fast wedding. Speed, Jackson calculated, would quiet the talk. He was catastrophically wrong. On the 1st of January, 1829, Margaret O'Neill Timberlake married John Henry Eaton. The wedding came barely 9 months after Timberlake's death. In an era when widows were expected to mourn for 2 full years in black, this was a provocation. Margaret wore no mourning clothes. She showed no public grief for the husband she had outlived. 3 months later, Andrew Jackson was inaugurated as the 7th President of the United States, and he appointed John Eaton as his Secretary of War. Margaret Eaton was now the wife of a cabinet secretary. She would be expected to attend state dinners, host receptions, make and receive social calls, and take her seat among the most powerful women in Washington. Every one of those women already knew the rumors. Every one of them had already made her decision. The most volatile woman in Washington was about to enter the most volatile room, and the most powerful man in the country was about to discover that the one enemy he could not defeat was a dinner party. Chapter 4. The inaugural ball where nobody spoke to her. On the 4th of March, 1829, Andrew Jackson entered the White House in a mourning band for his dead wife, and Margaret Eaton entered Washington society as the wife of the Secretary of War, and both of them were looking for a fight. Rachel Jackson had died on the 22nd of December, 1828, less than 3 months before the inauguration. The cause was a heart attack, but Jackson blamed something else entirely. He blamed the campaign. He blamed the newspapers that had called Rachel a bigamist, an adulteress, a disgrace. He blamed the political establishment of Washington that had whispered about his wife for 30 years. Standing at her grave, Jackson reportedly said, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers. I never can." He arrived in Washington a widower, consumed by rage and grief, and he carried that grief into the presidency like a loaded weapon. When the whispers about Margaret Eaton began, when the same social machinery that had destroyed Rachel started turning against another woman Jackson cared about, something inside the new president locked into place. This was not going to happen again, not on his watch, not to another woman he considered family. The problem was that Washington's social system did not care what Andrew Jackson wanted. To understand what happened next, you need to understand how power actually functioned in the early American capital. Washington in 1829 was a city of approximately 18,000 people. The political class was tiny. There were 6 cabinet secretaries and their families, a handful of Supreme Court justices, roughly 250 members of Congress, a small diplomatic corps, and a rotating cast of office seekers and journalists. Everyone knew everyone. Social life and political life were not parallel systems. They were the same system. The mechanism was the social call. Every week, cabinet wives were expected to make rounds. They visited each other's homes, left calling cards, received visitors in return. A visit was an act of recognition. A refusal to visit was an act of war. The dinner table extended this logic. Seating arrangements at state dinners reflected political hierarchies. The wife of the Secretary of State sat in a specific chair. The wife of the Secretary of War sat in another. To exclude a woman from your table was to declare that her husband did not hold legitimate power. The women who managed these rituals were not performing empty etiquette. They were operating the machinery of government. Into this system walked Margaret Eaton, a tavern keeper's daughter, a woman who had married too fast, mourned too little, and refused to look ashamed. The freeze was immediate and nearly total. Florid Calhoun struck first. She was the wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, which made her the highest-ranking woman in Washington society. Florid came from one of the wealthiest planter families in South Carolina. She was educated, formidable, and certain of her own authority. When the question arose of whether to call on Margaret Eaton, Florid's answer was simple and final. She would not. She called on Margaret exactly once, a single obligatory visit shortly after the inauguration, and never returned. She would not invite Margaret to her home. She would not attend events where Margaret was present. She would not acknowledge Margaret Eaton as a social equal. This was not merely a snub. It was a political declaration. The vice president's wife had announced that the Secretary of War's wife was unfit for polite society, and because Washington's social hierarchy was its political hierarchy, every woman in the capital was now forced to choose a side. They chose Florid's side. The wife of Secretary of the Navy, John Branch, refused to call on Margaret. The wife of Attorney General John Berrien refused. The wife of Secretary of the Treasury, Samuel Ingham, refused. Even Emily Donaldson, Jackson's own niece, who served as White House hostess in Rachel's absence, aligned herself with the cabinet wives against Margaret. Emily lived in the White House. She owed her position entirely to her uncle, and she chose Florid Calhoun over Andrew Jackson. The scale of the social embargo was staggering. In a capital where the entire governing class numbered in the hundreds, Margaret Eaton was cut off from virtually every social event that mattered. Dinner invitations disappeared. Reception lines went silent when she arrived. Women turned their backs. Men who wished to remain in good standing with their own wives stopped acknowledging her in public. Jackson watched this unfold and saw not a social dispute, but a conspiracy. Rachel had been destroyed by exactly this kind of coordinated cruelty. The same people, the same kind of people, the establishment, the old money, the women who appointed themselves guardians of virtue while practicing viciousness, were doing it again. He would not allow it. What Jackson did not see, or refused to see, was that the women leading the campaign against Margaret were not simply being cruel. They were defending the only territory they controlled. In a legal system where married women could not own property, could not sign contracts, could not vote, could not hold office, social authority was the single domain where elite women exercised real power. The drawing room was their Senate. The dinner table was their committee chamber. When Margaret Eaton walked into that space and demanded recognition she had not earned by their rules, she was not just offending propriety. She was threatening the only power these women had. Neither side understood the other. Jackson saw bigotry. The cabinet wives saw an invasion. Margaret, standing in the middle, saw only a world that refused to let her be what she had become. The President of the United States was about to do something extraordinary. He was going to take the question of a woman's sexual history and make it the official business of his administration. Chapter 5. The President put her virtue on trial. On the evening of September 10th, 1829, the President of the United States did something no president had ever done before. He summoned 5 cabinet secretaries and 2 clergymen to put a woman's chastity to a vote. The meeting took place in the White House. Jackson had been collecting evidence for months. He had dispatched investigators. He had gathered affidavits. He had interviewed witnesses. He had compiled a dossier that would eventually run to 93 pages, more paper than he devoted to any single piece of legislation during his entire presidency. The President of the United States had turned himself into a defense attorney, and the client was Margaret Eaton's reputation. The charges against her had multiplied throughout the spring and summer of 1829. Reverend John N. Campbell, pastor of the Second Presbyterian Church in Washington, the church Jackson himself attended, had been spreading allegations. Campbell claimed that Margaret had suffered a miscarriage before her marriage to Eaton, which would prove a sexual relationship, while Timberlake was still alive. He claimed there were witnesses to improper behavior at a hotel. He claimed that the evidence was overwhelming and that no decent woman in Washington could be expected to associate with her. Jackson was incandescent. He had already confronted Campbell privately. He had sent intermediaries. He had demanded evidence and received only second-hand gossip. Now he escalated. He brought Campbell and Reverend Ezra Stiles Ely, a Philadelphia clergyman who had been circulating similar accusations by mail, into the same room as his cabinet and laid the question on the table. The scene was extraordinary by any standard of presidential behavior. Picture it, the White House, a September evening. 5 members of the cabinet seated around the room, 2 clergymen facing the president, and Andrew Jackson, 62 years old, suffering from chronic pain, still wearing mourning for his dead wife, cross-examining a minister about whether a woman had slept with a man before her wedding. Jackson went through the charges one by one. The miscarriage. He produced a doctor's statement that it had never occurred. The hotel incident. He presented the hotel register, showing that the Eatons had stayed in separate rooms. Reverend Campbell's testimony. Jackson demonstrated that Campbell's sources were second-hand, based on gossip from a woman who had later recanted. Point by point, with the focus and fury of a battlefield commander, the president dismantled the case against Margaret Eaton. Campbell was shaken. Ely retreated from his strongest claims. The cabinet members sat in uncomfortable silence. The meeting ended without a formal verdict, but Jackson considered the matter settled. Margaret was innocent. He had proved it. The social persecution would now stop. It did not stop, not even slightly. The problem was that Jackson fundamentally misunderstood what was happening. He treated the Eaton affair as a factual question. Was Margaret virtuous or not? He believed that if he could prove her innocence, the social ostracism would end. But the women leading the campaign against Margaret were not operating on evidence. They were operating on social code. Margaret's specific behavior was almost beside the point. What mattered was what she represented. A woman from the wrong background who had been placed in a position above her station and refused to be humble about it. Daniel Webster, the great senator from Massachusetts, understood this better than the president did. Writing to a friend in the middle of the crisis, Webster predicted that the Eaton controversy would determine the next president of the United States. This was not hyperbole. Webster could see what Jackson could not, that the social war over Margaret Eaton had become a proxy for the political war between John C. Calhoun and Martin Van Buren for control of the Democratic Party and the presidential succession. John Quincy Adams, now a congressman after losing the presidency to Jackson, watched the spectacle with acid fascination. His diary entries from this period are devastating. He recorded every rumor, every maneuver, every absurdity. He noted that the President of the United States was spending more time defending a woman's honor than governing the country. He observed that the entire machinery of the executive branch had seized up over a question of her dinner invitations. Adams was exaggerating, but not by much. Cabinet meetings were tense. Cabinet dinners had become impossible. The secretaries could not bring their wives into the same room as Margaret Eaton without causing a scene. Government business that depended on social relationships, and in 1829, nearly all government business depended on social relationships, had ground to a halt. Margaret herself was not passive during this period. She confronted her accusers directly. She visited Reverend Campbell at his church and demanded that he retract his statements to her face. She was, by all accounts, furious rather than defeated. She did not weep. She did not withdraw. She did not perform the contrition that might have softened the opposition. She fought. This was either courage or miscalculation, depending on where you stood. In a system designed to punish women who refused to submit, Margaret's defiance only intensified the hostility against her, but it also earned her one crucial ally. Andrew Jackson looked at Margaret Eaton and saw what he had lost in Rachel, a woman who refused to let the bastards destroy her, and for that, he was willing to burn his own government down. The question was no longer whether Margaret would be accepted, it was who would be destroyed in the process of rejecting her. Chapter 6. The Vice President's wife drew a line. Floride Calhoun had one weapon available to her, and she used it with the precision of a general. The weapon was refusal. In a world where a woman's power resided entirely in her ability to grant or withhold social recognition, Floride Calhoun's refusal to acknowledge Margaret Eaton was the most consequential political act any woman in Washington performed during the Jackson administration. She understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else involved, that the dinner table was not a metaphor. It was the battlefield. Floride came from the Bono family of Charleston, one of the wealthiest slaveholding dynasties in South Carolina. She had married John C. Calhoun when he was a rising congressman, and she had managed their social position through his ascent to Secretary of War under Monroe and then to the vice presidency under both Adams and Jackson. She was accustomed to authority. She expected deference, and she had no intention of granting it to a tavern keeper's daughter who had married a senator after insufficient mourning and excessive familiarity. But Floride's motivations were more complex than simple snobbery. The doctrine of coverture, the legal principle that a married woman's identity was subsumed into her husband's, meant that women in early America had almost no independent legal existence. They could not own property in most states. They could not sign contracts. They could not sue or be sued in their own names. Their one domain of genuine authority was the social sphere, the guest list, the seating chart, the calling card, the invitation. When Floride Calhoun refused to receive Margaret Eaton, she was exercising the only real power she possessed, and she was defending it against what she saw as an illegitimate claim. The irony is bitter. Women enforcing social exclusion against another woman was not a failure of sisterhood. It was the predictable behavior of people defending the only territory they controlled. The enemy was not Margaret Eaton. The enemy was a system that gave women so little real power that they fought like cornered animals over the scraps. John C. Calhoun, meanwhile, performed one of the most cowardly acts of his long and complicated career. When Jackson confronted him about the social persecution of Margaret Eaton, Calhoun deflected entirely. This was his wife's domain, he said. He could not and would not interfere with a lady's social decisions. This was technically consistent with the era's gender conventions. It was also a transparent lie. Calhoun was using his wife as a shield, allowing Floride to fight the battle while he maintained plausible deniability. Jackson was not fooled. And then something happened that transformed the Eaton affair from a social crisis into a political rupture. In the spring of 1830, Jackson learned a secret that Calhoun had been hiding for over a decade. During the Seminole War of 1818, when Jackson had invaded Florida without clear authorization and executed 2 British subjects, Calhoun had argued within Monroe's cabinet for Jackson to be court-martialed. At the time, Jackson believed Calhoun had defended him. The discovery that his vice president had secretly tried to destroy him over a decade earlier was, for Jackson, the final proof of what he had suspected all along. Calhoun was his enemy. The Eaton affair was not separate from Calhoun's treachery. It was the social front of the same war. Enter Martin Van Buren. The Secretary of State was everything the Eaton's other allies were not: subtle, patient, and strategic. Van Buren was a widower with no wife to complicate matters. He could socialize with Margaret Eaton without domestic consequence. And he did so, with breathtaking calculation. Van Buren called on Margaret publicly and regularly. He arranged for the British and Russian ministers to include her at diplomatic events. He escorted her to functions where the cabinet wives would not go. He rode horseback with Jackson nearly every afternoon, spending hours in private conversation with the president, while other cabinet members could barely get a meeting. The Madame Huygens incident crystallized his strategy. The wife of the Dutch minister, Madame Huygens, was persuaded, likely at Van Buren's instigation, to host a ball where Margaret Eaton would be prominently included. The cabinet wives refused to attend. The diplomatic corps attended enthusiastically. Van Buren had demonstrated that the social embargo was not universal. It was specifically a campaign by the vice president's faction. Jackson saw exactly what Van Buren wanted him to see, that Calhoun's wife was leading the opposition, that Calhoun was hiding behind her, and that Van Buren alone had the loyalty to stand by the president when it counted. The political mathematics were now clear. Calhoun was the enemy. Van Buren was the ally. And the mechanism that had produced this realignment was not a policy debate, not a legislative battle, not a constitutional confrontation. It was the question of who was willing to sit next to Margaret Eaton at dinner. By the end of 1830, Jackson's cabinet was paralyzed. Meetings were poisoned by personal hostility. The Eaton affair had metastasized from a social controversy into an institutional crisis. 3 cabinet secretaries were openly hostile to the president. The vice president was in open political war with the White House. Government business was suffering. Something had to break, and Martin Van Buren, with the patience of a man who could see 3 moves ahead, had already figured out what it would be. Chapter 7. The Little Magician's Magnificent Sacrifice. Martin Van Buren's most brilliant political move was convincing the president to let him quit. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and ruthless in its logic. Van Buren proposed that he resign as Secretary of State. This would give Jackson the political cover to demand the resignation of the other cabinet members who had been involved in the Eaton controversy. It would look like a general house cleaning rather than a purge. Van Buren would sacrifice his own position to give Jackson the weapon he needed to destroy his enemies. The conversation reportedly happened on horseback, during one of their daily rides in the spring of 1831. Jackson resisted initially. Van Buren was the one cabinet member he trusted completely. Losing him felt like losing an ally to save enemies. But Van Buren pressed the logic. The cabinet as currently constituted could not function. Everyone knew it. A mass resignation, beginning with Van Buren's own, would reset the board entirely, and Van Buren made clear, without saying so directly, that his sacrifice would not go unrewarded. On the 11th of April, 1831, Van Buren submitted his resignation. On the 18th, John Eaton followed. Margaret was furious. She reportedly told her husband that resignation was surrender, that they were giving their enemies exactly what they wanted. She was not wrong about the optics, but she was wrong about the strategy. Van Buren and Jackson had already seen the endgame. The dominoes fell fast. Jackson demanded and received the resignations of Samuel Ingham as Secretary of the Treasury, John Branch as Secretary of the Navy, and John Berrien as Attorney General. Only William Barry, the Postmaster General, survived. In the space of a few weeks, the entire cabinet of the United States government was dissolved. This had never happened before in American history. No president had ever lost or dismissed his entire cabinet. The scale of the collapse was without precedent. 5 of 6 cabinet officers were gone. The government of the most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere had to be reconstituted from scratch because the wives of 3 cabinet secretaries had refused to have dinner with one woman. The numbers tell the story. The Petticoat Affair, as the newspapers now called it, had consumed more than 2 years of the Jackson presidency. It had generated 93 pages of presidential correspondence on the single question of Margaret Eaton's virtue. It had produced at least 4 formal investigations, 2 confrontations with clergymen, 1 extraordinary cabinet meeting devoted entirely to a woman's sexual history, and now 5 cabinet resignations. Washington's social season that year produced one of the most quoted toasts in political history. To the next cabinet, may they all be bachelors. Jackson replaced his entire government with men loyal to him personally rather than to any faction. This new cabinet, assembled outside normal channels and beholden only to the president, became known as the Kitchen Cabinet. It was a fundamental transformation in how the executive branch operated. Before the Eaton affair, cabinet secretaries were powerful figures with independent political bases. After it, they were the president's men, chosen for loyalty above all else. The modern relationship between the president and his cabinet, one of hierarchy rather than partnership, traces a direct line back to the crisis Margaret Eaton caused simply by existing. Van Buren, meanwhile, was exactly where he wanted to be. He had demonstrated total loyalty to Jackson. He had sacrificed his position without being asked. He had solved the president's most intractable problem. Jackson rewarded him with the ambassadorship to Great Britain, then the most prestigious diplomatic posting available. Margaret Eaton, the woman whose honor had precipitated the most dramatic governmental collapse in American history, was about to be sidelined. Her husband was out of the cabinet. The administration she had convulsed was being rebuilt without her. And the man who had defended her more fiercely than any husband ever had, the President of the United States, was sending her away from Washington. But the political consequences of the Petticoat Affair were not finished. The most spectacular backfire in the history of the vice presidency was about to begin. Chapter 8. A dual offer and a man who fled. The morning after the resignations, John Eaton sent a challenge to the former Secretary of the Treasury, and by nightfall, that man was running for his life. The aftermath of the cabinet dissolution was not a quiet transition. It was a knife fight. Ingham, Branch, and Buren had not gone quietly. They had been forced out, and they knew it, and they were furious. In the weeks following their departures, all three published public letters and statements attacking Jackson, accusing him of authoritarian overreach, and reiterating the charges against Margaret Eaton with renewed venom. Margaret's name appeared in national newspapers for the first time in ways she could not control. The Petticoat Affair had been a Washington story, confined to the drawing rooms and boarding houses of the capital. Now it was national. Papers in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston picked up the scandal. Margaret Eaton, her marriages, her morals, her background, every detail became public property. The woman who had been whispered about in parlors was now being discussed in print shops from Maine to Georgia. John Eaton's response was direct and of its era. He challenged Samuel Ingham to a duel. The challenge was delivered through Dr. Philip Randolph, Eaton's second. The terms were unambiguous. Ingham had impugned Margaret's honor. Eaton demanded satisfaction. In the honor culture of the early republic, particularly among men with southern and frontier backgrounds, this was not theatrical. Men killed each other over these things. Andrew Jackson himself had killed a man in a duel over insults to Rachel. Everyone in Washington understood that John Eaton was entirely prepared to shoot Samuel Ingham dead. Ingham was not prepared to be shot dead. On the night he received the challenge, the former Secretary of the Treasury gathered his belongings, slipped out of his lodgings, and fled Washington. He rode through the night and did not stop until he was safely across the state line in Maryland. The spectacle of a former cabinet secretary running from the Capitol to avoid being killed over a woman's reputation became instant legend. Even Ingham's allies found it difficult to defend. The duel that never happened nevertheless accomplished its purpose. Ingham was humiliated. Branch and Buren, watching their colleagues' flight, moderated their public attacks. The anti-Eaton faction had been routed, both politically and personally. But the most consequential aftershock of the cabinet dissolution was playing out in the Senate chamber. Van Buren's appointment as minister to Great Britain required Senate confirmation. Calhoun, still vice president and thus the presiding officer of the Senate, marshaled the opposition. The vote on Van Buren's confirmation ended in a tie. Calhoun cast the deciding vote against Van Buren. He was reported to have said to a friend, "It will kill him, sir. Kill him dead. He will never kick, sir. Never kick." It was the worst political prediction in American history. Van Buren's rejection by the Senate, engineered by Calhoun's personal vendetta, transformed Van Buren into a martyr. Jackson was outraged. The rejection confirmed everything Jackson believed about Calhoun, that the vice president was a treacherous enemy who would sabotage loyal allies for personal gain. Jackson's response was swift and decisive. He dropped Calhoun from the 1832 ticket and replaced him with Martin Van Buren as his running mate for re-election. This was the first time in American history that a sitting vice president had been replaced on the ticket. Calhoun's political career at the national level was effectively over. He would return to the Senate as a sectional champion of the South, but the presidency, the prize he had spent his entire career pursuing, was now permanently beyond his reach. Van Buren, meanwhile, went from rejected ambassador to vice president in a matter of months. When Jackson won re-election in a landslide in 1832, Van Buren was one heartbeat from the presidency. When Jackson retired after 2 terms, Van Buren succeeded him as the 8th President of the United States in 1837. Daniel Webster had been exactly right. A quarrel over who was willing to sit next to Margaret Eaton at dinner had determined the next president. The chain of causation was specific and traceable. Margaret's presence forced a social crisis. The social crisis became a political war between Calhoun and Van Buren. Van Buren's strategic kindness to Margaret won Jackson's loyalty. Calhoun's wife's strategic cruelty to Margaret lost it. The cabinet fell. Van Buren rose. The presidency changed hands. One woman's refusal to accept social exile had rewritten the political map of the United States, and she was about to be sent away from the country entirely. Chapter 9. The Queen of Spain received her. Washington never did. In Madrid, Margaret Eaton was everything Washington had refused to let her be. After John Eaton's resignation, Jackson offered him the governorship of the Florida Territory. It was both a reward and a removal. Florida in the early 1830s was raw, violent, and deep in the agony of the Seminole Wars. It was not Washington. It had no dinner parties that mattered, no calling cards to be left, no social hierarchy to enforce or resist. Margaret went from being the most controversial woman in the American capital to the wife of a territorial governor managing a frontier war. She managed it well. Accounts from the Florida period describe Margaret hosting military officers, managing household logistics in primitive conditions, and maintaining the social functions expected of a governor's wife with energy and competence. But Florida was exile, and both Eatons knew it. The appointment to Spain changed everything. In 1836, Jackson named John Eaton as the American minister to the court of Queen Regent Maria Cristina. The posting was both prestigious and, for Margaret, transformative. Spain did not know her history. Spain did not care about the boarding house on I Street or the mourning period she had cut short. Spain saw only what was in front of it. The wife of the American ambassador, a vivacious, intelligent, well-dressed woman who spoke passable French and charmed a royal court. Maria Cristina received Margaret at court with full honors. Margaret attended state functions. She dined with aristocrats. She was welcomed into the social life of the Spanish capital without reservation. The woman that Washington's finest families had deemed unfit to sit at their tables was sitting at the table of a European queen. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew the backstory. 2 rooms, 2 continents, 2 verdicts on the same woman. In one, she was a scandal. In the other, she was a success. The difference was not Margaret. It was the system of judgment. But Spain was also an ending. The Eatons were far from Washington, far from the political world that had defined their lives, far from the man who had fought for them. Distance and time did what social persecution could not. In 1840, John Eaton broke with Andrew Jackson over the question of Van Buren's re-election and the direction of the Democratic Party. The details are complicated, involving Texas annexation and the shifting alliances of the late Jacksonian era. But the result was simple. The defining friendship of John Eaton's political life was severed. For Margaret, this was the deepest loss. Jackson had been her champion. He had spent more political capital defending her than he had spent on any other personal cause during his presidency. The 93 pages of correspondence about her virtue, the cabinet meeting, the confrontations with clergymen, the willingness to destroy his own government rather than abandon her. All of it was rooted in Jackson's identification of Margaret's cause with Rachel's memory. When John Eaton broke with Jackson, Margaret lost not just a political ally, but the most powerful protector she had ever had. The reconciliation came too late to matter. By 1845, Jackson was dying at the Hermitage, his Tennessee plantation. He was suffering from tuberculosis, dropsy, and chronic pain. The Eatons made the journey to see him before the end. Jackson died on the 8th of June, 1845. Whatever was said between them in those final days was not recorded. Margaret was now in her mid-40s. She was the wife of a former cabinet secretary, a former governor, a former ambassador. She had been defended by a president and received by a queen. She had also been exiled from the city that mattered most, cut off from the political world that was her natural habitat, and separated from the man who had been willing to burn his government down for her. The years in Spain had been good. The return to America would not be. The woman who had survived the most powerful women in Washington was about to be destroyed by something she never saw coming. A 19-year-old Italian dance instructor with a talent for flattery and a capacity for theft. Chapter 10. A 19-year-old dancing master. In 1859, Margaret Eaton, now 59 years old and finally comfortable, made the one decision that would destroy everything she had left. John Eaton had died in 1856, leaving Margaret with a reasonable estate and, for the first time in decades, something resembling peace. The scandals were 30 years old. The women who had shunned her were dead or elderly. Margaret lived quietly in Washington, attended church, looked after her grandchildren, and enjoyed the modest respectability that time and irrelevance had finally granted her. Then, Antonio Buccignani walked into her life. He was 19 years old, she was 59, he was Italian, handsome, and worked as a dancing master, teaching polite movement to the children of Washington's families. Margaret's granddaughters were his students. That was how they met. What Margaret saw in Buccignani is a matter of speculation, companionship perhaps, a hedge against the loneliness of widowhood, a final act of defiance against a world that had always told her what she could and could not do. Whatever her reasons, Margaret married Antonio Buccignani in 1859, and the reaction in Washington was exactly what you would expect. The woman who had scandalized the Capitol 30 years earlier was back in the gossip columns. For 5 years, the marriage appeared to function. Buccignani managed Margaret's affairs. He lived in her home. He was present and seemingly attentive. But he was also, it turned out, systematically preparing to rob her. The end came with brutal efficiency. Buccignani convinced Margaret to sign over her property to him. The legal specifics varied in different accounts, but the result was the same. Margaret's assets, the house, the savings, the financial security John Eaton had left her, all of it was transferred into Buccignani's name. Once the transfer was complete, Buccignani left. He went to Europe. He took Margaret's fortune with him, and he took her 17-year-old granddaughter Emily with him. The granddaughter's involvement was the cruelest element. Buccignani had not merely stolen Margaret's money, he had stolen her family. Emily, the child Margaret had helped raise, went willingly with the man who had destroyed her grandmother. The betrayal was total. Margaret fought back. She filed for divorce. She pursued forgery charges. The courts granted the divorce and found Buccignani guilty of some charges. But the money was gone. The property was gone. The granddaughter was gone. Margaret Eaton, who had survived the combined hostility of every powerful woman in Washington, who had outlasted a vice president and outlived a president, was left with nothing. She was 64 years old. She was destitute, and the world that had once convulsed over whether to invite her to dinner could not have cared less. Chapter 11. A clear voice singing hymns in a charity home. The woman over whom a president had waged war and a vice president had lost everything spent her final years in a house for women who had nothing. Lochiel House was a home for destitute women in Washington. It was not the worst fate available to an elderly woman without means in 19th century America, but it was a long way from the Spanish royal court. Margaret moved there after the Buccignani disaster stripped her of every material asset. She brought nothing of value. She had nothing to bring. But Margaret Eaton had never been a woman defined by her circumstances. Even at Lochiel House, she maintained a presence that the other residents remembered. She was not pitied. She was not diminished. She was, according to the few accounts that survive, sharp, opinionated, and entirely herself. Age and poverty had not broken her any more than scandal and exile had. In 1873, at the age of approximately 73, Margaret dictated her autobiography. The project was a response to a biography of Andrew Jackson, written by James Parton, which had portrayed Margaret in terms she found unacceptable. Margaret's own account was, predictably, a defense. She denied the affairs, she defended her marriages, she presented herself as a victim of jealousy and political conspiracy. The autobiography was self-serving, as autobiographies tend to be, but it was also the only time Margaret Eaton's version of her own story was recorded in her own words. The document is revealing not for what it proves, but for what it demonstrates about Margaret's character. At 73, destitute, living on charity, separated from her family, her reputation long since settled into the historical record as either villain or victim, she was still fighting. She was still insisting on her version. She was still refusing to accept the judgment that Washington had rendered half a century earlier. On the morning of November 8, 1879, Margaret Eaton died. The accounts of her final hours come from the staff and residents of Lochiel House. She had been ill, declining gradually. That morning, she was heard singing a hymn in a clear voice. Her last recorded words were about the beauty of the world she was leaving. Then she was gone. She was buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown, beside John Eaton. The newspapers noted the passing with a mixture of nostalgia and the particular condescension that the press reserves for women who were once famous for the wrong reasons. One obituary observed that her neighbors in the cemetery included some of the most distinguished names in Washington history. In death, as in life, Margaret Eaton was surrounded by people who would not have invited her to dinner. The grave is still there. It is not a tourist destination. There is no plaque explaining that the woman buried beneath it once brought the government of the United States to a standstill. History forgot her, or rather, history filed her under scandal, under gossip, under the category of women who are remembered for what was done to them rather than what they caused. That filing is wrong, and it is time to correct it. Chapter 12. The Dinner Table That Ran the Government. Margaret Eaton never held a title, never controlled a fortune, and never made a single political appointment, and yet she generated more consequential political outcomes than most senators achieve in a lifetime. Consider the chain of events one more time. A tavern keeper's daughter married a senator. Washington society refused to accept her. The president defended her. The vice president's wife led the opposition. The defense of Margaret became a proxy war between two factions competing for the presidency. The cabinet collapsed. The vice president was replaced. The Secretary of State became vice president. The vice president became president. The rejected vice president became the champion of Southern sectionalism and the architect of the arguments that would lead, 3 decades later, to the Civil War. All of this because Florid Calhoun would not return a social call. The Petticoat Affair was not a footnote. It was a turning point. It created the kitchen cabinet, fundamentally altering the relationship between the president and his advisors. It destroyed the political career of John C. Calhoun at the national level, pushing him toward the regional extremism that produced nullification and, eventually, secession. It elevated Martin Van Buren to the presidency. It established the precedent that a president could dismiss his entire cabinet and reconstitute the government from scratch. Margaret did not plan any of this. She was not a strategist. She was not a political operator in the way that Van Buren was, or Florid Calhoun was, or even Andrew Jackson was. Her power was structural rather than intentional. She existed at the exact junction where social life and political life were the same system. And by simply being there, by refusing to leave, by declining to accept the verdict that polite society had rendered against her, she forced everyone around her to reveal their true loyalties. She was the catalyst, never the chemist. But the reaction she triggered reshaped the government of the United States. The deeper lesson is about the system itself. Social power and political power in America have never been separate. The dinner table, the guest list, the invitation, these were not decorations on the political process. They were the political process. The women who controlled social Washington in 1829 were not performing a trivial function. They were operating the machinery of government. When Margaret Eaton disrupted that machinery, the entire system convulsed, not because she was powerful, but because the machinery was. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. The women who excluded Margaret were defending the only power they had. Margaret, by insisting on her place, was claiming a power she had no institutional right to hold. Both sides were right. Both sides paid dearly. And the men who thought they were in charge, Jackson, Calhoun, Van Buren, Eaton, discovered that the social system they had always dismissed as women's business was, in fact, the operating system of their government. Margaret Eaton's legacy runs through American history in ways that are invisible until you know where to look. The kitchen cabinet she inadvertently created became the model for modern presidential staff. The vice presidential replacement she caused established a precedent that would be repeated throughout American history. Calhoun's turn towards sectionalism, accelerated by his break with Jackson over a woman's dinner invitations, led directly to the political crises of the 1850s and the war that followed. And there is one final, unexpected thread. Margaret Eaton's granddaughter, the same Emily who fled to Europe with Buccignani, later returned to America. Emily's descendants would include figures in New York society, and through them, connections to the world of fashion and media that eventually produced Vogue magazine. The tavern keeper's daughter from I Street, the woman who fought for a seat at the table, has a lineage that runs through the very institution that defines who belongs in American high society today. Margaret Eaton did not ask for permission. She did not wait for an invitation. She walked into the room where the decisions were being made, and she sat down. The room was not ready for her. The room tried to destroy her. The room failed to remove her in time, and by the time it succeeded, the government had already fallen. Every woman who has ever walked into a space where she was not expected, every woman who has ever been told that her presence was inappropriate, her ambition was unseemly, her past disqualified her from her present. Every woman who has been judged not by what she did, but by what someone said she did. Every woman who sat down anyway. Margaret Eaton was there first. The room did not survive her. The most dangerous thing a woman could do in early America was refuse to know her place. Margaret Eaton refused, and the United States of America has